Let me move on to some of the substance of your research. I think I'd like to start at the largest time scale, chapter 4, the last few 10,000 years. So the modern human mind evolved in a world of sparsely populated hunter-gatherer networks. We now have dense, large-scale cooperating communities, but they have only emerged within the last 10,000 years or so with a lot of pressure from agriculture. Does this suggest to you that large-scale cooperation is not natural for the human mind?
No, because when you start peeling the layers of human mentality, if you dig deep enough, you'll find a mammal, right? Because we all need to eat, sex, and so on and so forth. Then, if you go a little bit, the outer layer from the deep core is we are all great apes. All right. So we have males fight for status, and we can make coalitions with other individuals to get ahead and be very calculating and so on and so forth. The next layer is the hunter-gatherer. So this is the layer which allows us to cooperate in small groups of intimate friends and relatives. And finally, the final level is what allows us to function well in large-scale societies. Now, human evolution, we now know, over the past 10,000 years, genetic evolution has been very rapid. We can see it. There's all kinds of science that there's been a very rapid evolution. And as a result of that, it's incomplete, the transition to, Homo autrocialicus, whatever.
Right.
But we are halfway there. And so that means that we have both evolved cultural adaptations for living in large-scale society. So, for example, we translate our small-scale feelings for brothers and friends into a large-scale meaning. We just take that, for example, the father of the nation, the soldiers of brotherhood in arms, and so on and so forth. So we managed to expand many of those, adaptations that allowed us to live in small-scale societies and apply them. So when people think about the United States, for example, we always have some kind of a symbolic way to think about it as extended family or something like that. All right.
You might.
It's not true, but it's a good device which has been used by cultural evolution, hijacked by cultural evolution. But in addition to that, we also have many adaptations clearly at the genetic level also for living in large-scale groups.
Okay. What you were just saying made me think of the word co-opting. It's like some of the adaptations for small-scale cooperation got sort of co-opted for large-scale.
It's probably better than hijacking, yes.
And it's interesting because that suggests somewhat that we might cooperate best in societies that resonate to us in a way that families do. If we have father figures and if we can see lineages, for example.
Father figures, mother figures, but also respected elders, the individuals who are past their reproductive stage, but have accumulated a lot of wisdom. There is a very good book, if you haven't read it, by Sarah Pardee, Mothers and Others. I suggest that you will take a look at that.
Mothers and Others.
Yeah.
When I was reading your books, I came across a very interesting term that you've been popularizing, and I would like to hear you describe this concept of Asabiya in your own words, if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, that's pretty close. So this is actually an idea put forward by Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century thinker and historian, who lived in Tunisia, basically modern Tunisia. It's translated from Arabic as a group feeling, right? But it's a feeling of, or a feeling of togetherness and so on and so forth. So it's basically the capacity for cooperation. It's a capacity for cooperation at the level of a group. And Asabiya is a property not of individual, but it's a property of a group. So it requires not only people to be primed for cooperation, so be willing to sacrifice something for the sake of the common good, but it also requires the group to have the right institutions and organization. So institutions such as, drawing the boundaries, having a group identity very clear, ability for social fusion with the group identity, and then organizational structures, which is like having a leader or some kind of a council or whatever. So basically have a network through which information flows and decisions are made. So as idea of a group is determined by a complex of these factors.
And getting at the question of the genesis of Asabiya is very difficult but important, and maybe there really was no clear beginning. But what were some of the most effective social glues that helped some communities grow large into civilizations?
So, and that varies by scale, by the social scale at which you look at things. But at the national scale, certainly the very important role of ideology. So originally these were world religions, which allowed multi-ethnic empires to create a feeling of togetherness and of shared identity, right? Then it's on the institutional side, it's the state. Mm-hmm. So the state is really extremely effective organization. If you think about it, the first states appeared only maybe 5,000 years ago, and they very rapidly, by evolutionary time clock, they very rapidly took over the whole world. So now the whole world is divided up in states. So, and the states themselves have been evolving. They've been evolving to become better, and also more recently they've been evolving to generate common goods such as broadly based prosperity, right? Something that early states did not care about. So all those, these are all cultural results of cultural evolution. And all those traits and combination of traits, institutions, they are very necessary for us to be able to have functional states. And so now the great challenge is to extend this network of cooperation to the whole world, essentially, something that we have not been able to do here.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that theme a little bit later. When we go back to a world when civilizations and states were first forming, did new states have an effect on the behavior or the origins of civilizations nearby?
See, I prefer not to use the word civilization too much.
Okay.
Because it's what do you understand by civilization?
Well, I came to define a civilization as basically by population, as an organized polity of at least 100,000 people, including one city of at least 10,000 people. Yeah.
Right. I prefer the term that I have. Well, the term that people have used, ethne as nothing. I prefer meta-ethne. So meta-ethne is so if you think about Latin Christendom during the Middle Ages, that's a supranational group of people who had a shared identity, especially when they went on like crusades, right? So, as you might have gathered, I have a theory called theory of meta-ethnic frontiers. So, spatial areas where two different meta-ethnies actually are coming in contact and conflict, those areas are actually have been extremely productive in generating new states.
Right. It seems to me that we almost can't talk about cooperation without talking about competition. Do you see cooperation and competition as a yin and yang, two behaviors that necessarily must go together?
Yeah, pretty much, because the only way now we know that the only way that cooperation can evolve is in when you. So to put it very peacefully, humans have evolved cooperative groups that compete against each other. So we evolved cooperate to compete. So, but it's very important to look at what level competition happens. So if you have internal competition between members of the group, that's destructive of cooperation, and vice versa. There is actually a mathematical result called the price equation, which puts it very nicely. So the competition between groups is a very powerful evolutionary force for cooperation within groups.
You said that you started out studying population cycles, and you explained the rise and fall of ethnies or civilizations as following at least two cycles simultaneously. There are centuries-long secular cycles of social integration and disintegration, and then there are bi-generational cycles of peace and war. I would like to have you describe the dynamics of a typical secular cycle.
Yeah. Well, first of all, remember when you don't when we talk about cycles, we don't mean perfectly periodic cycles like planetary orbits or anything like that. Rather, what we're talking about boom bust dynamics. So there is something which is it's very interesting. Why would the system go first in one direction and then in another, and then maybe again? So what are the forces? What happens to forces that impel its movement in one direction? How do they switch around? And so they do different things. So that's the key approach. What we want to understand is this nonlinear dynamics, essentially, that result in booms and busts. So in terms of secular cycles, this is a very basic dynamic. Essentially, all complex societies, they have this integrative and disintegrative phases. So for maybe a century or so, a society is doing well, it's expanding, population grows, population density grows, the society may be successful at expanding its territory, it's reasonably unified inside, so it acts as a cooperative entity, at least at the level of the elites. All right, and then something happens. There is a crisis, and we get into the disintegrative phase when we have often fragmentation. The elites are fighting. The people are also very unhappy about the situation. Sometimes there is society actually is conquered by some other enemy. So there are all kinds of bad things happening. So this is the basic dynamic that we are talking about. Each the disintegrative phases, depending on the nature of society, sometimes they can be quite long, a century or even longer. Sometimes they could be quite short, if the society is so collapsed so badly that it's just taken over by some outside force, right? But overall, there is about a couple hundred years in sort of statistical periodicity of this boom-bust dynamics.
When I read about your secular cycles, there are a couple of details that surprised me. One of them had to do with the connection to population dynamics and overpopulation, and the other issue was the striation between the populace and the elites. Can you elaborate on those themes a little bit?
Yeah, so the population dynamic is a fairly Malthusian thing. So as I said, during the integrative phases, because the conditions are internal peace and order, that actually allows population to grow, because births outnumber deaths, and population grows. But then, especially in pre-industrial situation, you get to the point, because the primary economic basis is food production. By agriculture, you run out of free land, and so the population reach the conditions of overpopulation, and that results in popular immiseration. The well-being of most people declines. But at this point, when you start getting into this immiseration, what happens is that the elites, who, let's say, in traditional societies are landowners, among other things, they actually get a golden age. Actually, it's a gilded age would be a better way to describe it, because so they have their own land, which is the basic production factor for food and other things, which are in high demand because of the overpopulation. But labor is very cheap again, because there is oversupply of labor. And so they get a very favorable economic conjunction, and so they do quite well. But then a similar sort of dynamic sets in, because the numbers of elites increase, both by biological reproduction, perhaps, but also by upward social mobility. And at some point, even though the the amount of resources that elites are consuming has not gone down, but there are too many elites now. We have elite overproduction, and so on average, their incomes start declining. And of course, because there is a lot of inequality, there's some great winners, so who become even more wealthy. So the elites now start separating into frustrated elite aspirants who basically face the downward mobility, and super rich elites who are doing very well. And that's the recipe for disaster. And so that results in revolutions, civil wars, all kinds of turbulence, which sets the clock back, because during this period, population typically declines, and the elites are partly, they exterminate each other, partly some big swaths of them are forced into downward mobility into the commoner class, and so the system resets itself. And this is the basic dynamic. It's very amazing that it is essentially, it's sort of has not been, it's an inescapable view that we have not been able to escape so far, although hopefully in the future we will now, because now that we understand how it all works.
So we do still certainly observe these secular cycles happening today.
Well, so as I said, the United States is in a revolutionary situation. Mm-hmm. So we are in that crisis. Right now, we have, so it's, of course, the United States is not an agrarian society, but but there was a very similar process of oversupply of labor, which has developed over the past 50 or 60 years. And that has driven down the well-being of the majority of the population. So we have very clear conditions of immiseration, and we have very clear conditions of elite overproduction. Now, this is, you can just look at my book, Ages of Discord. And so we are, this is all, I wrote an article 12 years ago, which basically said that we will be in crisis in the 2020s, early 2020s. So that's basically what happened. So we are definitely repeating the same dynamics that have been prevailing over the past 5,000 years in other states.